The world watched as tensions escalated between the United States and one of its oldest allies. What started as territorial ambitions quickly transformed into a moment that would define Europe's resolve in standing with Ukraine. This is the story of how Denmark's principled stance sent shockwaves through international politics and reminded everyone what true alliance means in the face of pressure. In mid-January 2026, President Donald Trump reignited his long-standing interest in acquiring Greenland, the autonomous Danish territory. What began as political posturing quickly escalated into something far more serious. Trump announced plans to impose tariffs on Denmark and several other European nations, threatening a 10% import tariff starting February 1, 2026, with increases to 25% by June unless Denmark agreed to sell Greenland to the United States. The announcement sent shockwaves through European capitals. Trump's rhetoric grew increasingly aggressive, posting on social media that NATO should tell Denmark to get them out of here, now, while making dismissive comments about Danish defense forces in Greenland. He claimed that NATO had been advising Denmark for 20 years to address the Russian threat near Greenland, lamenting that Denmark had been unable to act. The implication was clear. Denmark was weak, ineffective, and unable to protect its own territory. But Trump and his advisors had fundamentally misunderstood who they were dealing with. Denmark, despite its small size, had become one of Ukraine's most steadfast supporters since Russia's full-scale invasion. This was not a nation that would bend to economic coercion or territorial demands, especially when principles of sovereignty and international law were at stake. Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen did not mince words in her response. Standing before cameras, she declared with unwavering conviction, "Europe won't be blackmailed." Her statement was direct, powerful, and unambiguous. Denmark would not surrender its territory, would not be intimidated by tariff threats, and would not compromise on the principles that had guided European security for decades. Frederiksen's defiance was rooted in more than just defending Greenland. It represented a broader rejection of the idea that might makes right, that economic pressure could override sovereignty, and that allies could be bullied into submission. For a prime minister who had spent years supporting Ukraine's fight against Russian aggression, the parallels were impossible to ignore. If Denmark capitulated to American pressure over Greenland, what moral authority would Europe have to condemn Russia's territorial ambitions in Ukraine? The Danish response went beyond rhetoric. While Trump threatened tariffs and made veiled references to military options, Denmark and its European NATO allies announced the deployment of additional troops to Greenland. This was not an act of aggression, but a clear signal that Denmark would defend its sovereignty with actions, not just words. The message was unmistakable. Territorial integrity matters, whether it's Greenland or eastern Ukraine. Understanding Denmark's forceful response requires understanding the country's deep commitment to Ukraine. Since Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, Denmark has provided approximately 70 billion Danish kroner, equivalent to nearly 9.4 billion euros, in aid to Ukraine. When measured relative to GDP, Denmark has provided more support to Ukraine than any other nation in the world. This wasn't merely financial assistance. Denmark donated its entire artillery system to Ukraine, along with F-16 fighter jets that have become crucial to Ukraine's air defense capabilities. In February 2024, when Frederiksen announced a 10-year bilateral security pact with Ukraine in the country's parliament, she received a standing ovation. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly praised Denmark as a model for other nations, stating that if all of Ukraine's allies had been as resolute as Copenhagen, the Russian aggressor would have been stopped long ago. Denmark's support extended beyond weapons and money. The country welcomed more than 50,000 Ukrainian refugees. It provided approximately 190 million euros specifically for the reconstruction of Mykolaiv, constituting 60% of all Danish funds earmarked for Ukraine's reconstruction efforts. Danish soldiers had joined training missions in Ukraine as early as 2015, well before the full-scale invasion. This commitment came with political consensus rare in modern democracies. 70% of Danes expressed positive attitudes toward this level of support. The Danish government viewed assistance to Ukraine not as charity, but as security policy, weakening Russia's ability to threaten the Baltic Sea region and preventing future aggression. When Trump demanded that Denmark choose between surrendering Greenland or facing economic consequences, Frederiksen saw the bigger picture. Capitulating to territorial demands from a supposed ally would undermine everything Denmark had fought for in supporting Ukraine. How could Denmark condemn Russia's attempts to seize Ukrainian territory while surrendering its own under economic pressure? Denmark's response didn't happen in isolation. Foreign Minister 𝙄𝙣𝙨𝙞𝙜 made Denmark's position crystal clear when discussing Ukraine peace efforts in late 2025. He warned that negotiations must not sideline Kyiv or Europe, rejecting any backroom territorial deals. Rasmussen identified Vladimir Putin as the main obstacle to peace and pushed for using frozen Russian assets to support Ukraine, while demanding automatic sanctions targeting Russia's shadow fleet. This principled stance on Ukraine's territorial integrity made Denmark's response to Trump's Greenland demands inevitable. Rasmussen emphasized that Europe must support Ukraine in achieving the best possible position, both on the battlefield and at the negotiating table. The Danish government understood that peace achieved through territorial concessions would only invite future aggression, a lesson applicable whether the aggressor was Russia in Eastern Europe or economic pressure over Greenland. The timing of Trump's demands made them particularly egregious. As Denmark continued announcing military aid packages to Ukraine, including a 29th package worth approximately 1.7 billion Danish kroner in December 2025, Trump was simultaneously threatening Denmark with tariffs and suggesting military options for taking Greenland. The juxtaposition was stark. Denmark was spending billions defending the principle of territorial integrity in Ukraine while facing territorial demands from its supposed NATO ally. European unity proved crucial in Denmark's ability to stand firm. The proposed tariffs targeted not just Denmark, but also Finland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom. By threatening multiple European nations simultaneously, Trump inadvertently strengthened collective resolve. European leaders recognized that if one nation capitulated to economic blackmail, all would be vulnerable to similar pressure in the future. As international pressure mounted and Trump's own advisors expressed concerns about the Greenland strategy, something shifted. Multiple key advisors had advocated for a more restrained approach, with several expressing reluctance about using military force to acquire Danish territory. White House personnel scrambled to prepare policies and ease allies' concerns as the situation threatened to spiral into a full-blown crisis within NATO. At the World Economic Forum in Davos on January 21, 2026, Trump took the stage and made a surprising announcement. Following meetings with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, Trump declared that he had reached a preliminary agreement concerning Greenland and that tariff threats were off the table. The specifics remained vague, but sources suggested a potential compromise where Denmark might grant the United States control over select areas of Greenland for military bases, a far cry from the outright purchase Trump had initially demanded. Trump attempted to frame the reversal as a negotiated success, claiming, "We've never sought anything else," and presenting it as his plan all along. But those who had followed the crisis knew better. Trump had explicitly threatened military action, posted aggressive demands on social media, and insisted on nothing less than Denmark selling Greenland entirely. The walkback represented a clear retreat from those maximalist positions. What caused this reversal? Denmark's unwavering stance played a crucial role. Fredriksson's public declaration that Europe would not be blackmailed resonated across the continent. The deployment of additional European troops to Greenland demonstrated that Denmark wasn't bluffing about defending its territory. European unity in the face of threatened tariffs showed that Trump couldn't simply divide and conquer his allies. Perhaps most importantly, Denmark's moral authority on questions of territorial integrity, earned through years of supporting Ukraine at tremendous cost, made its position unassailable. How could the United States demand territorial concessions from an ally that was spending more per capita than any other nation to defend Ukraine's territorial integrity against Russian aggression? The hypocrisy was too glaring to ignore, even for Trump's most ardent supporters. The Denmark-Trump confrontation over Greenland revealed fundamental tensions about the future of international order and alliance relationships. For Ukraine and its supporters, Denmark's stance offered crucial reassurance at a precarious moment. As Trump simultaneously pressured Denmark over Greenland and engaged with Putin on Ukraine negotiations, fears grew that principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity might be sacrificed for transactional deals. Denmark's refusal to bend demonstrated that some nations would not compromise on these fundamental principles, regardless of economic or political pressure. This mattered enormously for Ukraine's position. If a NATO ally like Denmark could be coerced into territorial concessions through tariff threats, Ukraine's hopes for preserving its internationally recognized borders would dim considerably. Conversely, if Denmark stood firm and prevailed, it would reinforce the principle that territorial integrity is non-negotiable for Greenland, for Ukraine, and for every nation facing similar threats. The crisis also exposed tensions within the Trump administration itself. That multiple senior advisors pushed back against military options for Greenland suggested limits to how far the administration would go in abandoning traditional principles of alliance relationships and international law. These internal divisions offered hope that even as Trump engaged with Putin on Ukraine, there would be voices within his administration advocating for positions that respected Ukrainian sovereignty. Denmark's example inspired other European nations to speak more forcefully about their commitment to Ukraine. When one small nation could stand up to the world's most powerful country on matters of principle, it became harder for larger European powers to justify wavering in their support for Ukraine. Fredriksson's leadership demonstrated that size and military power matter less than moral clarity and political will when defending fundamental principles. For Ukrainians watching these events unfold, Denmark's stance carried profound significance. Zelensky had previously praised Denmark as a model ally, stating that if others had shown similar resolve, Russian aggression could have been stopped long ago. Denmark's response to Trump validated those earlier assessments and demonstrated that its support for Ukraine wasn't merely opportunistic or temporary, but reflected deep-seated principles. The parallels between Greenland and Ukraine were impossible to ignore. Both situations involved larger powers seeking territorial concessions from smaller nations. Both featured economic pressure, threats of force, and attempts to portray the target nation as too weak to defend its own territory. Both raised fundamental questions about whether sovereignty and territorial integrity remained meaningful principles in international relations or had become negotiable commodities. Denmark's refusal to compromise on Greenland sent a clear message to Ukraine. Territorial integrity is worth defending regardless of the cost or the identity of the aggressor. This principle matters whether the pressure comes from Russia invading Ukraine or the United States demanding Greenland. Den's consistency on this principle gave Ukraine confidence that at least some European allies would continue supporting its fight for sovereignty, even as Trump administration pursued negotiations with Moscow. The crisis also highlighted the importance of European unity in supporting Ukraine. Trump's attempt to pressure multiple European nations simultaneously through tariffs backfired, strengthening collective resolve instead of dividing allies. This demonstrated that European solidarity could withstand external pressure, offering hope that support for Ukraine would continue even if American policy shifted. Throughout the Greenland crisis, Denmark never wavered in its support for Ukraine. In November 2025, the government announced its 28th donation package, with Defense Minister 𝙄𝙣𝙨𝙞𝙜𝙆 stating, "There is still a great need to support Ukraine's fight for freedom, and there is a need for other countries to contribute as well." Foreign Minister Rasmussen added, "As long as Putin and Russia do not want peace, we must ensure that Ukraine is in the best possible position, both on the battlefield and at the negotiating table." Even as Denmark faced American pressure over Greenland in December 2025 and January 2026, it continued announcing new aid packages for Ukraine. The 29th military donation package, valued at approximately 1.7 billion Danish kroner, was presented in December 2025. Denmark also committed to joint weapons packages with other Nordic and Baltic countries, ensuring sustained support regardless of individual national budget constraints. This consistency mattered enormously. Denmark could have used the Greenland crisis as justification for reducing its Ukraine commitments, arguing that it needed to prioritize its own territorial defense or couldn't afford to antagonize Trump while facing tariff threats. Instead, Denmark demonstrated that support for Ukraine and defense of Greenland weren't competing priorities, but complementary elements of the same principle. Territorial integrity is non-negotiable. Fredriksson's earlier statements about Ukraine took on new resonance during the Greenland crisis. She had declared that Ukraine today is a guarantee of Europe's security, and that financial and military support is an investment in the continent's safety. When Denmark refused to compromise on Greenland, it validated these statements by showing that Denmark genuinely believed in the principles it espoused regarding Ukraine. The vague agreement announced at Davos left many questions unanswered, but the trajectory was clear. Trump had backed away from his maximalist demands for purchasing Greenland outright. Any final arrangement would likely involve enhanced American military presence in specific areas rather than sovereignty transfer. Denmark had successfully defended its territorial integrity while maintaining the NATO alliance relationship. This outcome offered several crucial lessons for Ukraine and its supporters. First, principled stances matter even when facing seemingly overwhelming pressure. Denmark, a nation of fewer than 6 million people, stood up to the world's most powerful country and prevailed because it held firm to non-negotiable principles. Ukraine's insistence on restoring its internationally recognized borders similarly reflects principles that cannot be compromised through economic incentives or pressure. Second, consistency strengthens credibility. Denmark's years of supporting Ukraine at tremendous cost gave it moral authority that made its Greenland stance unassailable. Nations cannot credibly defend sovereignty and territorial integrity selectively. Either these principles matter in all cases, or they don't matter at all. Dan's consistent application of these principles across different situations reinforced their universality. Third, unity multiplies strength. Trump's attempt to pressure multiple European nations simultaneously backfired because it fostered collective resistance rather than individual capitulation. For Ukraine, this demonstrates the continued importance of maintaining European unity in support of its territorial integrity. Attempts to divide European allies or negotiate separate deals with individual nations will likely fail if European solidarity remains strong. Fourth, internal opposition within even hostile administrations can create opportunities. That Trump's own advisors pushed back against the Greenland military option shows that institutional restraints and internal advocacy can moderate extreme positions. As Trump engages with Putin on Ukraine negotiations, similar internal dynamics may help prevent agreements that compromise Ukrainian sovereignty. The Denmark-Trump confrontation over Greenland concluded with Trump's Davos reversal, but its implications will resonate far longer. For Ukraine, Denmark's example demonstrated that small nations with principled leadership can resist pressure from far more powerful actors when defending fundamental rights. The crisis reinforced that territorial integrity remains a core principle worth defending, regardless of economic costs or political convenience. Fredriksson's declaration that "Europe won't be blackmailed" became a rallying cry extending far beyond Greenland. It represented European commitment to the rules-based international order, to sovereignty and territorial integrity, and to standing with Ukraine against Russian aggression. When Trump tested whether economic pressure could override these principles, Europe's answer, delivered most forcefully by Denmark, was an unambiguous no. The crisis also revealed limits to American leverage over European allies, especially on matters of core principle. Trump discovered that tariff threats and aggressive rhetoric couldn't compel allies to surrender territory or abandon fundamental values. This bodes well for Ukraine's position, as it suggests European support will continue even if American policy shifts toward accommodation with Moscow. Denmark's role in supporting Ukraine will likely continue evolving, but not diminishing. Despite planned reductions in aid levels from the peak years of 2024 to 2025, Denmark remains committed to ensuring Ukraine maintains strong positioning both militarily and diplomatically. The country's leadership recognizes that security in the Baltic Sea region depends fundamentally on preventing Russian victory in Ukraine. For Ukrainians watching these events unfold from a nation still fighting for its survival, Denmark's stance offered both inspiration and reassurance. It demonstrated that principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity can still mobilize nations to resist pressure, that alliances based on shared values can withstand internal tensions, and that small nations defending just causes can sometimes prevail against seemingly overwhelming power. The Denmark-Greenland-Ukraine saga ultimately raises profound questions about the meaning of alliance in the 21st century. Are alliances merely transactional arrangements based on immediate security and economic interests? Or do they rest on shared values and principles that constrain how allies treat each other? Can larger powers legitimately pressure smaller allies into territorial concessions through economic coercion? Or does alliance membership provide protection against such treatment? Denmark's response answered these questions unambiguously. Alliances must be based on principles, not just power. Territorial integrity applies to all nations, not just to those with sufficient military strength to defend themselves independently. Economic coercion by allies is no more legitimate than military aggression by adversaries. And perhaps most importantly, consistency matters. Nations cannot credibly defend principles in one context while abandoning them in another. These answers matter enormously for Ukraine. If alliance relationships were purely transactional, Ukraine's prospects would depend entirely on whether supporting it served the immediate interests of more powerful nations. But if alliances rest on shared principles, sovereignty, territorial integrity, democratic governance, the rule of law, then Ukraine's cause becomes inseparable from the broader health of the international system these principles undergird. Denmark, despite its small size and limited military power, emerged as a champion of principle-based international relations. Its unwavering support for Ukraine, combined with its refusal to compromise on Greenland, demonstrated that moral authority can rival military and economic power in shaping international outcomes. Fredriksson's leadership showed that doing the right thing, even when difficult, expensive, or politically risky, builds credibility that proves invaluable when facing pressure. What began as Trump's renewed ambitions for Greenland transformed into a defining moment for European resolve and the principles underlying support for Ukraine. Denmark's principled stance, refusing to be blackmailed over Greenland while maintaining steadfast support for Ukraine, demonstrated that territorial integrity remains a non-negotiable principle worth defending regardless of economic pressure or the identity of those applying it. Fredriksson's declaration that Europe won't be blackmailed resonated far beyond Greenland policy. It affirmed European commitment to the sovereignty and territorial integrity that Ukraine has fought to defend since Russia's invasion. By standing firm when pressured by a supposed ally, Denmark reinforced the universality of these principles and the moral authority Europe derives from consistently defending them. For Ukraine, Denmark's example offers both inspiration and practical reassurance. It demonstrates that small nations can resist pressure from great powers when defending fundamental rights. It shows that consistent support for principles builds credibility that proves crucial when facing challenges. And it confirms that at least some European allies will continue supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity regardless of shifting political winds in Washington. The crisis also revealed that aggressive unilateralism has limits, even for the world's most powerful nation. Trump's retreat from maximalist demands for Greenland suggests that bullying allies carries costs and that principled resistance can succeed. These lessons apply directly to Ukraine's situation, offering hope that European support will endure even as Trump pursues negotiations with Moscow. Denmark's dual commitment, defending Greenland while supporting Ukraine, exemplified the kind of principled foreign policy that builds lasting security. By refusing to compromise on territorial integrity in either case, Denmark demonstrated that these principles aren't negotiable based on political convenience or economic pressure. This consistency strengthens the broader international order and makes it harder for any actor, whether Russia in Ukraine or others elsewhere, to achieve territorial gains through aggression or coercion. As the situation continues evolving, Denmark's role as a steadfast Ukraine supporter and defender of sovereignty principles will likely remain crucial. The nation's outsized contributions to Ukraine, both military and financial, combined with its willingness to stand up to pressure from all directions, make it a model that other nations should emulate. Fredriksson's leadership showed that moral courage and principled stands can shape international outcomes, even for small nations facing pressure from great powers. The Denmark-Trump confrontation over Greenland, viewed through the lens of Ukraine support, ultimately reaffirmed that principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity remain meaningful in international relations. They are worth defending at considerable cost. They apply universally, regardless of which nations are involved, and they can mobilize resistance sufficient to deter even powerful actors from pursuing maximalist demands. For Ukraine and all nations fighting to preserve their territorial integrity, Denmark's example offers both a model and a source of hope that principle can still prevail over power.